Welcome to the Business of America Miami with your host, Gelet Fragela.
Welcome to Business of America. I'm your host, Gelet Martinez Fragela, and today's episode covers a topic that every business owner needs to understand, but many try to avoid: taxes. Joining me today is my dear friend, Marcell Felipe. He's a seasoned tax attorney from South Florida, and Marcell has helped guide entrepreneurs at every stage, from early startups to multi-million-dollar enterprises, through all the complexities of tax law. So whether you're already on a business or if you're thinking about opening one, this is an episode you do not want to miss, because we're going to be breaking down tax law in a way that is practical, clear, and very easy to understand.
If your plan is, I hope the government doesn't find out, then you've got no plan at all. The government is the biggest partner that you will always have in your business. You buy a $1 million building with $200,000 of down payment, but your deduction on that building is 20%. Your deduction equals your down payment. Try to figure out the rules so you can see where you could legally take advantage of it, turn this into an opportunity. They just recently settled the case for $511 million. The IRS, they've detected over 400 illegal accounts worth about $4 billion. There may be some additional. The one thing you should not do in tax planning, what definitely isn't tax planning, is hiding money. It's not a solution, and ignoring it could have very, very expensive and unintended consequences that you didn't budget for.
So many of us, if people are listening from South Florida, you're very well known in our community. You're one of the leaders of the Cuban-American community. For those who might not know you, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your business, and a little bit about your story?
Yeah. Well, my family and I came from Cuba through Costa Rica as refugees in 1981. And we settled here in South Florida. I was 11 years old. So we've got to see how other parts of the world live by getting my primary education somewhere else. But then I had the good fortune to be able to go through my teenage years and formative years here, and then went to school here first in the local universities, Miami-Dade College, Florida International University. And I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, which is increasingly, one of the top law schools in the country. Very fortunate the time that I got to spend in Pittsburgh. So I've been able to get a little bit of that flavor. And now perhaps it's my Cuban exile or U.S. immigrant side of me that always had this entrepreneurial spirit. So I wanted to start the business of a law firm, which it's not really a business, a profession, but you have to run it like a business as well. As soon as I graduated, I couldn't, and thank God, because it's good to have some experience under you. I had to wait for my wife to graduate from the University of Pittsburgh as a dentist. So I got to work for a Pittsburgh law firm for a couple of years. They were one of the very few firms doing international tax work in Pittsburgh. They had a Washington, D.C. office, and then eventually, after two and a half years, I came and opened their Miami office. And eventually, as they had partnership issues, I bought out and kept the Miami office. That was in 2002. Since then, we've had Marcell Felipe attorneys, which have grown to a handful of attorneys. 4 to 6 attorneys usually, and we've kept it about that size, but we've grown extensively in the quality of the clientele. Our clientele, sometimes we joke that we represent billionaires, but in reality, while we do have a good bit of billionaires, especially for firms of our size, we represent businesses, as you had said, from startup to well-funded conglomerates. And we do that as a small firm because I always like to keep that control. Larger firms tend to be a collection of practices, and you could end up with all the politics between having 100 partners or so. You could always find yourself in positions that you don't want to be in. So I didn't want to take that route. And then I've used some of the wealth that we've generated through the law firm for real estate investments, to develop a real estate investment fund that's been very, very successful. Our typical lifespan of clientele or what have you is we started as a tax firm doing tax work for folks that were selling their businesses. And so that's our primary specialty. But after that, that person then starts new businesses that led us into corporate and real estate as well. So in a nutshell, that's what we do on the business side, not to be mixed with the civic engagement side of what we do.
So, what inspired you to get into this specific field of tax law?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, it really wasn't something that I started out saying this is what I'm going to do. In fact, I was, by all intents and purposes, bound to be a litigator. I had developed the best closing, according to my professor, the best closing argument, not only of that year, but one of the best in his 25 years of teaching. And everybody expected me to go into litigation. But we had this job and they had that need for tax. And as I learned the tax system, I realized that it's really like a puzzle. It's really, when you do and you structure your transactions correctly, everything can be so efficient. And when you don't know tax, I don't know how you do business law without knowing tax, because there are so many traps for the unwary, so many things that you could do wrong that later could be extremely, extremely costly, that I felt this is basic, this is essential. You want to do business, you really got to know this as a bottom line start to any business that you do.
So, why do taxes end up being one of the biggest blind spots for entrepreneurs, and how can that blind spot become a business killer for many business owners?
It can, because what happens is when you started with income tax, and we haven't always had income tax. That's something that started, say, in the last 100 years or so of U.S. history, and it starts with something basic. We're going to charge you a certain percentage of your income. But any tax system, there will always be the incentive by Congress to use it as a means to try to reward certain behavior or punish certain behavior. So from there, you begin with something as basic as you can get a tax deduction for charitable contributions, because we want to encourage charitable contributions, and so forth. And as that develops, it takes on its own life, and it becomes so complicated when you put one rule on top of another that it isn't always logical. And so that's where a lot of people make crucial mistakes, because since it's not always logical, you might just say, listen, I'm going to change this from one company to the other. I still own it. Both are my companies. So I'm just going to do it. And then it turns out that transfer has generated a huge tax liability that you didn't know about. So that's the reason.
I think I mentioned this before we started recording. For most of us, a tax code feels more like a burden than a tool for building wealth. So, what advice would you give business owners on how to better use the tax code to their advantage?
Yeah, well, look, it is a burden. If I were to start fresh and be made king for a day, I'd get rid of the income tax code. I think there's better ways to generate revenue for the government than through income tax. Every time you're taxing something, you're in a way penalizing it. So you're penalizing the generation of income, the generation of wealth. But having said that, it's a reality. It's a reality that we have, and it's not a reality that's going to go away anytime soon. So you've got to learn the rules, and you got to learn which rules apply. There are so many that it's impossible to cover them all in a podcast, and some that apply to very specific industries and not others. But there are a lot of benefits. For example, one of the questions that we get is, we had a great year. What do I do? And when your gain is from selling real estate, it's very easy. Well, maybe I shouldn't say very easy. For some of the newer entrepreneurs, they may not be aware that there are statutory protections, such as Section 1031. A 1031 transaction is one where, when you sell your property and you exchange it for one of higher or equal value, you don't pay any tax. The reasoning behind that in the tax code is you might have changed the specific real estate, but you're still in a real estate investment. So your original investment is your basis for later determining your gain, and it carries forward. Whenever you cash out of real estate into cash, eventually they'll tax you. But until then, you can sell one property. It's got to be an investment property. Exchange it for another property, and you don't pay any tax on the sale of the first one. Same thing. You could do it again for one or higher value. And there's people that have done that throughout their life. And at the end of their life, their kids inherit that property. And when their kids inherit it as if they were buying it for fair market value. So that tax never got paid. So that's a small little loophole. But then you say, well, what about people that their income isn't from real estate? They just had a great year, professional athlete or someone that just did really, really well in their business. Well, there's the reverse. You could buy real estate and get a deduction from that. When you buy real estate, you are buying both the land and a building. The land is not depreciable, but the building, the concept is that as it gets older, it's worth less. And the government has this thing called depreciation, that they allow you to take a deduction as if it was an expense for the loss of value of the building. And it's usually 3 to 4% a year of the value of the building. So you buy $1 million worth of property, your accountant will say, let's say 200,000 was for the land. I can't do anything with that, but I got 800,000 that was for the building, and 3 or 4% of that will be a deduction every year. That's the basic and the standard. But very few people know that if you can do a cost segregation study, you hire some engineers and they do this study that they say, well, the 800,000 isn't all building. The 800,000 includes an air conditioning system that depreciates in 10 years or 15 years, or the doors that depreciate in 5 years, or whatever it is, so that all the components that you're buying, there's an allocation of that $1 million where it's going. And some of those components, the depreciation deduction you could take in 5 years. That means if certain set of components total $100,000, you can now take $20,000 of those components as a deduction, and that really reduces your income tax liability and so forth. When you put it all together, what that means is, on average, as a rule of thumb, you invest $1 million, you buy $1 million building, and you usually will be able to take a $200,000 deduction using a cost segregation study. Now, if you're buying that building with 20% down and you're getting 20% of the value of the building, of the entire million, then you're getting a 100% deduction. Let me repeat that again to make sure people understand it. You buy a $1 million building with $200,000 of down payment.
Okay.
But your deduction on that building is 20% of the million. So your deduction is 200,000. Your deduction equals your down payment. So basically, you've made, let's say this year, you made an extra $200,000 beyond what you need to live. You could take that 200,000, buy a $1 million building with financing, and that 200,000 gets completely deducted from your taxes. Now you have $200,000 less to pay tax on. So those are ways that you could certainly save and turn this into an opportunity.
Amazing. We just received a very expensive tax consultation for free. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. Another question, and based on what you're explaining, so would you say that tax planning actually gives a business a competitive advantage then, from what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you just take that same example and the $200,000 and you pay tax on it, you got $150,000 or what have you, you got $150,000. In the other scenario, you didn't pay any tax. That's now generated an asset for you that's going to be hopefully appreciating if you've done a good investment over time. And after 2 or 3 years, your $200,000 is worth a lot more than their $120,000 because they went from 200 to 120 after paying tax, or 130, whatever the tax bracket is. Even if they invest that's going to have to make a lot of money to just catch up to your 200, whereas you already have the 200 in that real estate. So think about it this way. The government is the biggest partner that you will always have in your business. And if you could figure out a way to legally not pay the government, then it's an extra 30-40% that you keep for yourself. It's a huge return. And therefore tax planning, which is usually, some fees to an attorney or an accountant, it's a great return on investment.
Yeah. So would you say that the tax code is designed to benefit business owners more than employees? And why is that the case?
No, I don't think it's designed specifically. The tax code almost has its own life, and every Congress has new priorities depending on the results of that election, the mood of the country at a particular time, and so it becomes a hodgepodge of things. And there are provisions in the tax code to help employees. There's provisions in the tax code that help businesses. It's not necessarily a contradiction, and in some cases you can use both. If you create a retirement plan for your business, for example, it allows your employees to set aside a certain amount of their income and put it tax deferred into a retirement account, and you as an employer can contribute to that. But if you do that and you allow your employees to do that, then as a business owner, you could also participate in that. And now you can create for yourself a retirement account in which you, as the highest paid employee of the company, can put a significant sum of money, $50,000 into a retirement account without paying any taxes on it. You only pay taxes on it when you take the money out of the account eventually when you retire. So there's a lot of ways that businesses can find synergies with their employees, so that it helps both the business and the employee. The toughest planning is for very, very highly paid employees, folks like professional athletes, doctors who are making $500,000, $1 million, $2 million a year, but of salary income. Those folks are usually in the toughest position, because as a business owner, let's say, this year we probably make quite a bit of money from a case that just settled, a big case that just settled that made a lot of news. One of the things that we often find ourselves needing, and that it's a justifiable business expense, is an airplane. If I buy an airplane, it's a business expense, and I could offset a significant part of that. But not only is it a business expense, so we go back to the original example, I can offset the entire cost of the airplane, or not the entire, a significant portion of the airplane, but I don't have to pay for it. I only pay a down payment. That's an asset I can finance. I can give 25% down, finance the rest, and yet I get a deduction based on the entire price of the airplane. So businesses have a lot of ways to do this, but when you're an employee, you're that doctor that's making $700,000, or a professional baseball player making $1.5 million in salary income, a top level executive. It's very difficult. You don't have business expenses that you could generate. And I think that's when you have to start focusing on planning that is related to pension plans, but that only goes so far. It's a smaller amount, or using real estate, or using other, starting up new businesses. Because it is more in favor of the business owner than the employee when you get to that point of the very highly compensated employee. Those guys really do have an issue.
So to summarize, for what I understand, then you have two advices for those scenarios: a side business, for example, or investing in real estate. You would say that that's one of the most effective strategies to generate wealth and also reduce some of this
investments in oil and gas wells as well. For those that have very high income, but from employment sources, it's very difficult. It's very difficult for a number of reasons. You could take deductions and generate deductions through real estate, but to qualify for those, you need to be a real estate professional. And to qualify as a real estate professional, you need to develop a substantial amount of time to real estate. And if you're a highly paid employee, chances are you won't be able to do so. So there might or may not be limited in your ability to use real estate as one of the vehicles. There may be other things that you can use. Oil and gas, for example. Oil and gas investments have a tax preference in that uh, when you invest in an oil and gas, but we're not talking about royalties or stock in an oil and gas company, but a direct investment in a group of oil and gas wells. And there's a lot of folks in Texas that promote direct investments. Is what's called a working interest in an oil and gas well. And usually you don't invest in one, you invest in a portfolio of actual wells. But you actually, it's like owning real estate. You actually own through different structures that directly own the well. And for every dollar you invest, as a rule of thumb, this is not a general rule, it's a rule of thumb, about 70 cents of that investment is tax deductible. So if you're an employee that you made $1 million, you invest $700,000 in an oil and gas well, your income will be reduced to about $300,000. So you pay tax only on $300,000, not on your $1 million, and you've put that money into the oil and gas well. Obviously, there's risk to the oil and gas. Although for some of the folks that are not so familiar with those types of investments, it's not so risky as folks outside of that oil and gas industry believe. It's not sort of like, hey, this is Texas, let's drill and see if we find something. Generally, you're in locations where there's oil and gas under that patch of land. That's that group of counties or that county. Pretty much there's oil and gas everywhere, and it's a matter of finding the properties that would allow you to drill, getting a lease on that property, and drilling on the property. A lot of times it's folks that have farms, and they allow an oil and gas operator to drill on a particular section of the farm, and they still keep their farm and what have you. So it's something that is available, and it's a thriving industry. So you've got to look at opportunities like that for the employees that are more making more general salaries, 50, 100 grand, 120 grand. Then you could look more of IRA type of things, retirement plans. Those will have a bigger impact without the necessity of taking on all these other more fancy strategies. And some of these fancy strategies cost money to implement. So, it depends on the place where the individual is in their business career.
So I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, that big case that made headlines everywhere. It was a big settlement that the Department of Justice secured from Credit Suisse, around $500 million, and you were directly involved in that. I want to go back to discuss a little bit more in detail that case, but first I'm also curious, how do you land a case like that? You mentioned in the beginning that many of your clients come through referrals. So would you say that word of mouth has been a key factor in your success?
Early on in my career, we did conferences and seminars, and we would get cases through those conferences and seminars that we would do at investor conferences and what have you. But for quite some time, it's really all been on a referral basis. We don't do any marketing, advertising, or what have you. And that's a general rule that I would always advise, not just for attorneys, but anyone in any profession. Treat your client right. Do right by them. Don't worry about nickel and diming to the last possible penny. Make sure they leave with a positive experience. And every one of your clients is a marketing machine for you. And we had a referral. These clients came to see us. They're Swiss bankers. And, to give some context to the viewers and listeners, in about 2008, 2009, UBS had a huge case where they were sued by the U.S. government for conspiring with U.S. taxpayers to defraud the IRS. And it was a novel case. Basically, the IRS took the position, I don't care if what you're doing is legal in Switzerland. You know that what our clients are doing with you is illegal in the United States, because you're basically just putting, knowing that they have an obligation to pay me taxes, you're putting these accounts, knowingly creating these accounts with offshore companies, which, by the way, all of that is perfectly legal. But it's not perfectly legal when you're not reporting it to the IRS, when you're not even telling them. And so, and when we get a wind of somebody, you help them move that out to a foreign relative, everything with the express intent of not paying us. As a result of that, UBS had to pay a big settlement, and the fallout from that was that the government they said, you know what, we know that there's other Swiss banks that from this investigation, that there's other Swiss banks and there's other people at UBS that have accounts at UBS that we don't know about. If you come forward, we will give you an amnesty and reduce penalty. And a lot of people started coming forward. And that generated.
I imagine.
Yeah, no, I mean, because at that time, it's like you gotta get discovered and face prosecution, or you come forward. And from all the people that started coming forward, one of the things they did was ask information. That generated a microscope over what was then their competitor, Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse is one of the largest banks in the world. And Credit Suisse is a bank that has a lot of histories of non-compliance with a lot of stuff, a lot of histories of dealing with rogue governments, a lot of history of dealing with relatively unscrupulous characters. And Credit Suisse CEO came to the United States and said, you know what? Yes, we are also like UBS, have accounts of Americans, and we'll give you those names. And we will give you the names of the bankers that were involved. That we had no idea. So some of those bankers said, well, these guys were the ones training our entire department, and we're not going to go to jail for them. And they came forward and they expressed their concern with us, and we provided that information to the U.S. government. Result, you've heard had a professor at Rutgers University that had almost $200 million of undeclared funds. It turns out Credit Suisse had told the U.S. they had given everybody up all the names, but they failed to mention this one big fish that had $200 million. That, interestingly enough, the attorney that represented the bank in that case was a gentleman by the name of Christopher Wray. Now, at that time, that name didn't really mean anything to me. I was like, okay, it's just an attorney out of New York. As this case develops and the U.S. starts cooperating and getting more and more people that are getting caught under this net, first they went after the taxpayers, then they go after the bank, basically for lying. Or let's correct that, for at a minimum not realizing that members of management, of the management structure, are actively concealing the involvement of this professor, Dan Horsky. You guys can Google it. So the professor then also participates, and it ends up building a huge case against the bank. As it turns out, in 2017, we think we're ready to get a big judgment against the bank that the U.S. is going to settle. This lawyer by the name of Christopher Wray gets appointed as director of the FBI. I don't know if it was coincidence. I can't really speak to it, but my impression is that the case pretty much stalled after Christopher Wray became director of the FBI. Is there a correlation? He's not directly supervising the case, so maybe not. Maybe not. We do know that the bank was one of his biggest clients. And it isn't until the end of the Biden administration, just around the time that Christopher Wray decides to resign, that there is finally a potential settlement. Now, the potential settlement, as reported by the Wall Street Journal in early January, was $200 million. Whereas our legal team, had been in talks with the U.S. Senate and the committees that oversee this, and everybody thought that Credit Suisse should pay around 1.2 billion with a B. Reason being, they had originally in 2014 pled guilty and paid 1.2 billion in penalties out of a potential one. They have paid a total of $2 billion, but 1.2 were penalties that ranged that could have ranged between 1.2 and 2.4, and they were 1.2 because of their cooperation with the government, and then it turns out they weren't cooperating. So Senator Wyden and a U.S. Senate report concluded that it should be at least 1.2 billion. And here, the last days of the Biden administration, they were ready to settle for 200 million. Some members of our team jumped up at that, and fortunately, the incoming administration stopped it, and they just recently settled the case for $511 million, which is a lot lower than we expected. On the other hand, we'll wait and see, because the IRS did announce that they've detected over 400 more illegal accounts worth about $4 billion. There may be some additional penalties coming, not to the bank, but to the different account holders. And so we were very pleased to be, that's one of the largest tax settlement cases in U.S. history. Collectively, the clients for the multiple law firms that are involved and multiple clients, collectively, everyone's getting about $150 million in whistleblower fees. And obviously that gets divided into a lot of people. But it was very rewarding, and it does show now, for going back to this, the more practical aspects of this for business owners. The one thing you should not do in tax planning, what definitely isn't tax planning, is hiding money. If your plan is, I hope the government doesn't find out, then you've got no plan at all. Those 400 American accounts are going to get hit with some hefty fines at best, and some with prison time. That is not a plan. We usually structure the plan so that even if the government finds out that you have everything, or you're reporting it to the government, legally you don't have to pay tax. That's the right way to do tax planning. Some folks say, well, how is the government ever going to know that I'm doing X, Y, and Z? And you'll be surprised. Number one, businesses and individuals are audited at random, but the higher the income, and the greater the likelihood that you'll be audited at random. And if you've got a business, it's also a higher likelihood of be audited at random. But more importantly, there's a lot of audits that come as a result of whistleblowers. The IRS pays whistleblowers between 15 to 30% of what the IRS collects, which is why after this $511 million settlement, there's whistleblowers getting $150 million, slightly more than $150 million, 30%. So there is an incentive for the ex-wife, the ex-secretary, or ex-partner, usually the disgruntled people in your life that knew all the details, to go and write it out to the IRS. Now, the IRS usually doesn't take this information, or doesn't offer a reward, rather, on this information, unless there's $2 million or more for them to get. But they'll take the information and not pay an award if it's less. So they love divorces. They love both real divorces and business divorces, because a lot of stuff comes to light. So again, my number one advice would be, do it properly. There's so many ways to do it properly that there's really no reason to take the risk in doing it unlawfully.
Definitely. So I wanted to point out, going back to your previous comments about Christopher Wray's involvement, it is my understanding also that he was appointed to the Credit Suisse case way before 2017, when he was appointed for the director of the FBI. It dates back to 2014. So this is a case that has been going on for almost over a decade, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Even a little bit before that. In other words, as a result of the UBS case, Credit Suisse got into a settlement with the U.S. where it paid $2 billion. A lot of places have been reported like $2.6 billion, but the payment to the U.S. was $2 billion, and that was about 600 and something million in lost taxes and 1.2 in penalties. Chris Wray was the one that signed that settlement deal on behalf of Credit Suisse. As a private lawyer for Credit Suisse. He was a
part of King Spalding, I believe, that law firm.
Correct. He was a partner at that law firm, and if I recall correctly, this settlement agreement was 2014, but his last year at King and Spalding, He made seven figures from, if I recall correctly, don't quote me on this, just from the bank. Was his biggest client. And so he had that relationship. He did that deal. He was instrumental in the representations to the government that the bank was clean. And then it turned out that the bank wasn't clean. That doesn't mean that he knew that the bank wasn't clean or that he was lying. We're not suggesting any of that. But it ended up that he made the representations and they turned out to not be 100% accurate, in the sense that there were other American accounts there, or let's say that at least it wasn't what the government expected. The end result is that after that happens, and that predates even 2014, that deal is signed in 2014, in May of 2014, but goes to conduct that was occurring in 2008, 2009, 2010, and what have you. But as they signed that deal in May of 2014, we're sitting there a month later, explaining to the U.S. government how one of the biggest fish, which is this professor, has a $200 million account that has never paid tax, and and it's there. It contradicts this concept that the bank has basically turned over all of the accounts, and so later in 2017 is when he becomes a director in the FBI. And from my perspective, might have just been a coincidence, but we felt that the case really slowed down after he became a director at the FBI. Now, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm not here to make any accusations. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. It got slow because while he was there, he was helping the bank cooperate. Maybe. All I know, it felt like it slowed down when he got in there, and it felt like it got resolved after he left.
So I want to go back to the whistleblower impacts and the legal protections that whistleblowers get in this case. What are those protections that are in place, especially in such an international financial context, where how effective they are really when you change from one jurisdiction to the other?
Yes, the U.S. has a program for whistleblowers, and not just for the IRS. There's a number of different things where if you know someone is scamming the government, overcharging the government, committing fraud against the U.S. government, and you have information on, you can provide that information. You register as the source of the information with the government, and the government will give you a reward. That reward varies depending on the program, but it could be up to 30% of what the government recovers. Now, a lot of folks say, yes, but I don't want my name exposed. The reality is your name is kept confidential. And the only way a whistleblower's name, which doesn't happen, but the only way it could happen, doesn't tend to happen, is if the defendant company that is committing the fraud decides that they're going to go all the way to trial, defend it in trial, and they have a Sixth Amendment constitutional right to figure out if the accusation that you're making is the crux of it, is the only reason or the only evidence that the government has, then they have to figure out the source of that information. The reason that doesn't happen is because generally, if you have damning information, one of two things will happen. The person will plead guilty, and case gets closed, and no one ever knew the source other than the government itself, the whistleblower's office. Or second, the government uses the information you provided to build a case, and the case rests not specifically on the information you provided, but on other evidence. To put it in more layman's terms, for things that we're more familiar with, like a murder mystery. If you come forward and you tell the government, hey, I know where the body is, I know how they killed him, because I was there and I witnessed it, what have you. And then the government can, and I know that there's a camera, and then the government goes and finds the camera that has the footage, finds the body, finds the murder weapon. Your testimony isn't needed at trial to convict. And so you could remain anonymous in that scenario. Same thing happens, obviously, with different set of facts and evidence in a tax or business controversy. If the whistleblower provides the information, they could generally remain anonymous throughout the entire process. And there's a whistleblower's office there that represents in many ways the interest of the whistleblower program, which has been very, very effective. And there's senators that are, very like Chuck Grassley, who are very much Ron Wyden in favor of the whistleblowers programs and strengthening the whistleblower programs because it's revenue for the government. It's really almost free revenue for the government.
So would you say that this case sets a new legal precedent in a way in terms of holding financial institutions accountable for breaching prior agreements with regulatory bodies like this? Because there was an agreement in 2014 between Credit Suisse.
Yeah, I think that there's, one of the things is Credit Suisse had pled guilty to this. So in a way, there is it's a bad precedent because I think the government should have been much more strict in this case, should have charged a much higher penalty to the government. So in that sense, it almost sets a bad precedent. Now I'm sure most companies don't want to pay $511 million. Sure. Certainly, they're not getting away with nothing. But I think they could have fared a lot worse. And I think part of the reasoning here is Credit Suisse and whatever Credit Suisse did is not continuing. UBS bought Credit Suisse last year in a government brokered takeover because Credit Suisse had so many issues. Credit Suisse had issues pretty much in all continents for all kinds of dubious activities relating to foreign governments, tax fraud, all sorts of different things. So in a way, I think part of the reasoning was the person that's going to pay these fees is a legal person, a bank that is no longer in business. It's been taken over by UBS, who has been a lot cleaner and a more responsible corporate citizen. And so therefore, there's no need to kill it if it's going to die anyways. So, yeah, but in terms of the amount, it's definitely one. I think it might actually be the largest, but if not, it's one of the largest. Certainly, when you combine it with the other 2 billion that they paid and others of the fees that they paid in the earlier case to New York and the SEC, it probably is one of the largest corporate fines in history.
And it is my understanding that they were concealing over $4 billion in assets from many accounts were primarily in Singapore, correct?
And not just in Singapore and in Switzerland. And they were concealing assets. There was information and evidence that has come out where they're actively involved in changing and destroying bank documents as to who the record owner is. And facilitating for their clients to abandon citizenship or open the accounts on a different passport or put it in the name of a relative that's not the real owner. There were really things that you're not supposed to do under the rules and the law. So it was a little bit of a cowboy operation there at Credit Suisse for a while. It's an interesting story for those that like business and want to study it a little bit further. At one point, the bank CEO was spying, I guess, their top banker. And that ended up in high-speed car chases throughout Switzerland, the streets of Geneva. It was espionage and the entire bit, very much made for a movie. So the bank was a little rogue. It was a little rogue, and certainly UBS, the modern UBS, doesn't have that reputation. And I think UBS helped a lot in making this a smaller settlement than it should have been.
Definitely. So what actually triggers, Marcell, an IRS audit? Going back to many business owners around America that could learn from this story, even if obviously they're not concealing that amount of money or anything like that, but what could trigger an IRS audit, and what can you do to lower your risk?
Well, look, there's a couple of different things. So number one, there's audits that are done at random, as we have mentioned before, and that's a low percentage that are done at random. There's audits that are done based on someone providing a tip of you doing something unlawful with your money. Um, and the third is there's a computer system that looks at things that are really out of the ordinary. So, for example, you have $100,000 of income and you are reporting $50,000 of charitable deductions or $70,000 of charitable deduction. That's not normal. To have the charitable deduction be such a large part of your income when it's 50,000 or 100,000 is, in other words, if somebody has a $10 million of income and they have $5 million of charitable deduction, that's high, but you could still live with the other 5 million, less
Correct.
taxes. So that by itself is not as suspicious as someone that has $100,000 and they're trying to take a $50,000 tax deduction for charitable contributions and then living on 50,000 minus their taxes. That is a lot less normal. So
Sure.
the computer picks up on things like this in proportions, and that could trigger an audit as well. Certainly when there's different levels of audits. There's a preliminary review, and then there's more in-depth review, and eventually a field audit. Or in forensic audit, more in cases where they believe that there's criminal activity from the get-go. But having your taxes done by an accountant certainly lowers your risk. When you do it yourself, there's a little bit more room for error. The IRS knows that because they're not just looking for fraud by a criminal mastermind. They're also looking for mistakes where by making an adjustment, they could collect more money. So folks that mistakenly even take a deduction that they're not entitled to, they look at that. They look at that and they try to recover that money, just a return and recover that money. So having an accountant certainly helps. If you're not going to have an accountant, at least get one of the programs that are getting better and better, like H&R Block, TurboTax, and use one of those. Don't go it alone. In fact, it's a lot easier to do it through TurboTax and H&R Block than to do it on your own. The IRS website is great. They have a lot of information. And they make it easy for you, but certainly the commercial services are a lot better. And if you can, use an accountant.
So if you could give one piece of advice to every business owner when it comes to taxes or when they're setting up the structure of their business, what would it be?
Play by the rules. Play by the rules. Try to figure out the rules so you can see where you could legally take advantage of it and where you could legally get that competitive edge. Hiding is not a solution, and ignoring it could have very, very expensive and unintended consequences that you didn't budget for.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a wrap on today's episode, and huge thanks to you, Marcell, for breaking down tax law in a way that actually makes sense for many of us and might even save many people around America, many people listening to this serious money. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.